A routine flight turns into an extraordinary journey when Sarah, a young African-American nurse struggling to save her grandmother, finds herself seated next to Maxwell, an arrogant millionaire who publicly humiliates her. What neither of them anticipates is that an elderly stranger on board is about to turn their lives upside down, triggering a series of events that will test their values, challenge their beliefs, and force them to confront painful truths about themselves. Get ready for an emotional story of redemption, compassion, and the surprising connection between strangers at 30,000 feet. It was a fall afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia, when Sarah Johnson, a 28-year-old African-American nurse, received a call that would change the course of her life. The shrill sound of her cell phone echoed down the hospital hallway where she had been working tirelessly for over 12 hours straight. "Sarah, it's Aunt Edna. Grandma Rose. She's not doing well. The doctors say she might not have much time." The voice on the other end of the line trembled, filled with worry and sadness. Sarah's world seemed to slow down. Her grandmother, the woman who had raised her after the tragic loss of her parents in a car accident when she was just 7 years old, was on her deathbed in Los Angeles. Without a second thought, Sarah decided she needed to be by her grandmother's side, no matter the cost. With trembling hands, she began scouring airline websites on her phone, desperately searching for a last-minute flight to Los Angeles. Each click felt like an eternity, and the exorbitant ticket prices made her heart sink. As a newly graduated nurse still paying off her student loans, Sarah could barely cover her monthly expenses. Finally, she found an economy-class ticket that, although still expensive, was the only viable option. Without hesitation, Sarah used all the money she had saved for emergencies and booked the flight. The following hours were a blur. Sarah rushed to her small apartment, threw some clothes into a worn-out suitcase, and headed to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. The Atlanta traffic seemed to conspire against her, every red light increasing her anxiety. Arriving at the airport, Sarah found herself engulfed in a sea of people, all seeming to know exactly where they were going. For her, it was completely unfamiliar territory. She had never flown before, and the thought of being on a plane thousands of feet in the air made her stomach churn. With a racing heart, she approached the check-in counter. The attendant, a middle-aged woman with a rehearsed smile, asked for her ID and ticket. Sarah handed everything over with trembling hands. "First time flying, dear?" the attendant asked, noticing Sarah's evident nervousness. "Is it that obvious?" Sarah replied with a shy smile. "Don't worry, it's safer than driving. You'll be fine." The attendant's words, though kind, did little to calm Sarah's nerves. She took her boarding pass and headed to the security area, where long lines of passengers waited to pass through metal detectors. As she waited in line, Sarah couldn't help but notice the stark differences between herself and many of the other passengers. Well-dressed executives with designer luggage, upper-middle-class families ready for vacations, all seemed so at ease in this environment. Sarah, with her old suitcase and simple clothes, felt out of place. After passing through security, she finally reached her departure gate. The large electronic board displayed, "Los Angeles, boarding in 30 minutes." Sarah sat down in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, trying to steady her breathing and hold back the tears that threatened to fall. Her thoughts drifted to her grandmother Rose. She remembered Sunday mornings in the kitchen, learning to make the family's famous cornbread. The nights when her grandmother comforted her after nightmares about her parents' accident. The inspiring stories about the civil rights struggle Rose shared, encouraging Sarah to always fight for her dreams, no matter how difficult the path. The boarding announcement snapped her back to reality. With shaky legs, Sarah stood up and joined the line. Each step towards the aircraft increased her nervousness. As she boarded the plane, the narrow aisle and cramped economy seats made her feel claustrophobic. Finding her window seat, Sarah settled in, fastening her seatbelt with trembling hands. She closed her eyes, trying to recall the breathing techniques she taught her patients to control anxiety. "It's going to be okay," she murmured to herself. "Grandma Rose needs me. I can do this." As the plane prepared for takeoff, Sarah looked out the window, watching the airport staff moving about on the tarmac. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a beautiful sight, but Sarah could hardly appreciate it, her heart pounding in her chest. The plane's engines roared to life, making the entire aircraft vibrate. Sarah gripped the armrests tightly, her knuckles turning white. As the plane began to move, she closed her eyes again, praying silently. Please, God, get me there safely. Please let me see my grandmother one more time. The plane sped down the runway, and Sarah felt her stomach drop as the wheels left the ground. She was in the air, on her way to Los Angeles, on a journey that would change her life in ways she could never have imagined. Little did Sarah know, her true challenge wouldn't be the flight itself, but the extraordinary encounters and events awaiting her in the coming hours. Destiny had planned a journey far beyond a simple trip from Atlanta to Los Angeles, a journey that would test her courage, compassion, and determination in ways she never expected. Sarah barely had time to get used to the sensation of being in the air when she felt someone settling into the seat beside her. Slowly opening her eyes, she found herself face to face with a middle-aged man, impeccably dressed in a suit that looked more expensive than her annual salary. "What the hell is this?" the man muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't pay a fortune to fly this airline to end up in economy class." Sarah instinctively shrank back, trying to make herself as small as possible in her seat. The man next to her was Maxwell Rothschild, though she didn't know that yet. All she knew was that he radiated an aura of arrogance and privilege that made her feel even more uncomfortable. Maxwell glanced around with obvious disgust, his gaze finally landing on Sarah. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, and a sneer formed on his lips. "Well, at least now I know why the hospital disinfectant smell is so strong here," he remarked, pointing at the nurse's uniform Sarah was still wearing. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame and indignation. She had come straight from work, with no time to change due to the urgency of the situation. "Excuse me, sir," she began, trying to stay calm. "I'm a healthcare professional and—" "Spare me the details, dear," Maxwell interrupted brusquely. "Just try not to contaminate the air I breathe. All right?" The comment felt like a punch to the gut. Sarah had never been treated with such disrespect in her entire life. Meanwhile, Maxwell continued to complain loudly, as if he wanted the whole plane to hear his discontent. "This is outrageous. A booking error," they said, as if I, Maxwell Rothschild, should be subjected to this. "I'll sue this airline into bankruptcy." The name caught the attention of some nearby passengers, who began whispering among themselves. Sarah realized that her seatmate must be someone important, which only made the situation worse. A sudden bout of turbulence made the plane shake, and Sarah gripped the armrests, her fear of flying surging back with full force. Maxwell noticed her panic and laughed mockingly. "First time flying, huh? Let me guess, you won the ticket in some charity raffle." The sarcasm in his voice was palpable. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm herself and ignore the malicious comments. "Actually, I'm going to see my grandmother who is very ill." "Oh, the old sick grandmother story," Maxwell scoffed, making air quotes with his fingers. "I hope you're not expecting some substantial inheritance. Judging by your appearance," he paused, glancing again at her simple clothes. "I doubt your family has much to leave." His words were like knives, each one more painful than the last. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give this horrible man the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The situation worsened as the turbulence increased. The plane was shaking more violently now, and Sarah couldn't hold back a small scream of fright. Maxwell rolled his eyes dramatically. "Oh, for God's sake, if I had known I'd have to endure this, I would have demanded a first-class seat, even if I had to buy the whole plane." A flight attendant approached, drawn by the commotion. "Is everything all right here, sir?" Maxwell seized the opportunity to spew more venom. "No, everything is not all right. I've been relegated to economy class due to an error by your airline, and now I have to share space with this," he gestured disdainfully toward Sarah. The flight attendant cast a sympathetic glance at Sarah before turning back to Maxwell. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Rothschild. Unfortunately, The flight is completely full, but I'll do my best to make your journey more comfortable." Sarah watched in astonishment as the crew began to treat Maxwell with special deference, bringing him champagne and snacks that were clearly not offered to regular economy class passengers. Meanwhile, the man continued his monologue of complaints and veiled insults, alternating between criticizing the airline and making derogatory remarks about Sarah and other passengers around them. "You know," he said, turning to Sarah with a malicious smile, "people like you should be grateful for the opportunity to sit near someone of my caliber. Who knows? Maybe a bit of my class will rub off on you." Sarah felt a wave of anger rise in her chest, but years of dealing with difficult patients had taught her to maintain her composure. She limited herself to responding with a firm look, refusing to stoop to his level. The next few hours promised to be the longest and most uncomfortable of Sarah's life. Trapped between her fear of flying and the toxic presence of Maxwell Rothschild, she wondered how she would survive this trip. Little did she know that the events that would unfold in the coming hours would drastically change the course of this flight and their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. As Sarah tried to ignore Maxwell's demeaning comments, she didn't notice that they were being closely observed. Sitting directly behind them was an elderly man of unremarkable appearance who kept his eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. The old man, dressed in simple, slightly worn clothes, didn't stand out at first glance. His graying hair and wrinkled face suggested a long, possibly difficult life, but his eyes, hidden behind thin-rimmed glasses, shone with surprising intensity, capturing every detail of the interaction between Sarah and Maxwell. In his calloused hands, he held an old, tattered notebook. With discreet and precise movements, the elderly man made constant notes, his pen moving quickly over the yellowed paper. To a casual observer, he might have seemed like just a passenger keeping a travel journal. But there was something more to his behavior, a focused attention that suggested a greater purpose. The turbulence that had frightened Sarah earlier began to worsen. The plane shook violently, causing several passengers to exclaim in surprise and fear. Sarah gripped the armrest so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her eyes closed in silent panic. Maxwell, on the other hand, seemed more annoyed than scared. "This is ridiculous," he raged. "As if being stuck in this class with commoners wasn't enough. I have to endure this infernal flight." The elderly man leaned slightly forward, his ears attentive to every word exchanged between the two passengers in front of him. He scribbled something in his notebook, his eyes never leaving the scene. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, trying to calm the passengers. "Please keep your seatbelts fastened. We're passing through an area of turbulence, but it should pass soon." Maxwell seized the opportunity to make another snide comment. "Look, nurse," he said, turning to Sarah with a sneering smile. "Even the flight attendant seems calmer than you. Maybe you should consider a career change since you clearly don't have the nerves for stressful situations." Sarah, still with her eyes closed and breathing heavily, didn't respond. She was focused on trying to control her panic, mentally recalling the breathing techniques she used with her patients. The old man behind them frowned, making a quick note in his notebook. His previously neutral expression now showed a hint of disapproval directed at Maxwell. As the turbulence subsided, Sarah slowly opened her eyes and let out a shaky sigh of relief. It was then that she noticed, for the first time, the man sitting behind them. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Sarah felt a strange sense of comfort in the old man's gentle expression. Maxwell, oblivious to the silent exchange, continued his monologue of complaints. "You know," he said, turning to Sarah again, "people like you really shouldn't fly if you can't handle a little instability. Leave the traveling to those of us who actually matter in the world." The old man cleared his throat softly, as if he wanted to say something but held back at the last moment. Instead, he made another note in his notebook, his face now clearly showing a mix of interest and concern. Gathering some courage, Sarah finally responded to Maxwell. "Sir, I understand that you're frustrated with the flight situation, but that doesn't give you the right to be cruel. We're all in the same boat, or rather, plane." Maxwell laughed sarcastically. "Oh dear, do you really believe that? Look at you and look at me. We're not even close to being in the same boat. The only reason you're here is probably some kind of charity or mistake." The elderly man shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with what he was hearing. He seemed to be preparing to intervene, but at that moment, the pilot made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the turbulence. We will be entering more stable weather soon. Please keep your seatbelts fastened as a precaution." Everyone's attention was momentarily diverted by the announcement, creating a pause in the tension that had been building. Sarah took the moment to compose herself, taking deep breaths and trying to ignore the toxic presence beside her. The elderly man behind them continued his silent observation, his pencil constantly moving over the paper. There was something in his eyes, a mix of wisdom, compassion, and perhaps a touch of cunning that suggested he was more than just a casual observer. As the flight continued, the dynamic between Sarah, Maxwell, and the mysterious observer behind them began to crystallize into something more complex and intriguing than any of them could have imagined. The stage was set for events that would change their lives in unpredictable ways, with the silent old man playing a much larger role than his modest appearance suggested. The flight continued with a tense calm after the turbulence. Sarah tried to distract herself by looking out the window, while Maxwell occasionally grumbled about his undignified situation. The elderly man behind them remained vigilant, his pencil silently dancing across the pages of his notebook. Suddenly, a flight attendant approached Maxwell's seat, leaning in discreetly to speak with him. "Mr. Rothschild," she whispered, but not quietly enough to prevent Sarah and the mysterious observer from hearing. "I wanted to personally apologize for the inconvenience with your reservation. It is an honor to have you on board." Maxwell's eyes lit up with satisfaction. "Well, at least someone here recognizes who I am," he responded arrogantly. "I hope the airline is prepared to adequately compensate for this grotesque error." The attendant nodded nervously. "Of course, sir. Our team is already working on it. If there's anything I can do to make your journey more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask." As the conversation continued, Sarah couldn't help but listen. Her curiosity was piqued. Who exactly was this man beside her that deserved such special treatment? The elderly man behind them seemed equally intrigued, leaning slightly forward to catch every word of the conversation. His notes became more frantic, as if every detail was of vital importance. Maxwell, clearly enjoying the attention, began to speak louder, almost as if he wanted everyone around to hear. "You know, it's really absurd that someone of my stature has to go through this. Do you have any idea how many jobs my company creates? How much we contribute to the economy?" The attendant continued to nod servilely, while Sarah struggled to contain her growing discomfort. The contrast between the treatment Maxwell received and how he treated her was glaring. At that moment, Sarah's phone vibrated in her pocket. With trembling hands, she took it out and saw a message from her Aunt Edna. Her heart sank as she read the contents. "Sarah, Grandma has gotten worse. The doctors aren't sure if she'll make it through the night. Please come quickly." The tears that Sarah had been holding back finally began to fall. She tried to stifle them, but a sob escaped, catching Maxwell's attention. "Oh, for God's sake," he said, rolling his eyes. "Now I have to endure a melodramatic scene?" The elderly man behind them cleared his throat audibly, as if he wanted to intervene, but held back once more. His notes, however, became even more intense. Summoning all her courage, Sarah turned to Maxwell. "My grandmother is dying," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "She might not survive until I get there. I'm sorry if my pain bothers you, but this flight means everything to me right now." For a brief moment, something resembling empathy flickered in Maxwell's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by his usual disdain. "Well, I hope you don't expect me to offer any consolation. We all have our problems." The elderly man behind them finally spoke, his voice surprisingly firm for someone of his age. "Sometimes, sir, a little compassion can work wonders." Maxwell turned, annoyed at being confronted. "And who are you to tell me how to behave?" The man merely smiled enigmatically and returned his focus to his notebook, leaving Maxwell even more intrigued and irritated. The flight attendant, sensing the rising tension, quickly intervened. "Mr. Rothschild, can I get you anything else? Perhaps a blanket or an extra pillow?" Maxwell, momentarily distracted, turned his attention to the attendant. Yes, yes, bring me a double whiskey. I need something to get through this infernal flight." As the attendant moved away to fulfill the request, Sarah tried to compose herself, silently wiping away her tears. The elderly man watched her with compassion, as if he wanted to say something comforting but remained silent. The flight continued, the atmosphere thick with tension, secrets, and raw emotions. Sarah, racing against time to reach her grandmother. Maxwell, an arrogant magnate hiding his own insecurities behind a facade of superiority. And the mysterious elderly man, observing and noting everything, as if each detail of this interaction was a piece of a larger puzzle. Little did they know that the events to come in the next few hours would turn this journey into something far beyond a simple flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles. Destiny had surprising plans for this unlikely trio, and the revelations that awaited them would shake their lives in ways none of them could predict. The flight continued in a tense atmosphere. Sarah struggled to hold back her tears, thinking about her grandmother, while Maxwell sipped his whiskey with an air of superiority. The mysterious elderly man kept taking notes, occasionally glancing at the two. Suddenly, a sharp scream pierced the air from a few rows ahead. "Help! Someone! Please help!" The scene that followed was chaotic. A middle-aged man had collapsed in his seat, his face pale and contorted in pain. His wife, in a panic, was screaming for assistance. "He's having a heart attack," someone shouted. Without hesitation, Sarah stood up. Years of training and experience as a nurse kicked in. "Excuse me, I'm a nurse. Let me through, please." She quickly made her way down the narrow aisle, ignoring the surprised looks from other passengers. Reaching the man, Sarah immediately began assessing the situation. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, checking his vital signs. There was no response. Maxwell, watching the scene from his seat, couldn't resist a sarcastic comment. Well, looks like our little nurse is going to get a chance to prove her worth. Let's hope she knows what she's doing." The elderly man behind him gave a disapproving look but remained silent, observing closely and taking frantic notes. Sarah, oblivious to the comments, was completely focused on her patient. "I need space. Does anyone have a first aid kit?" A flight attendant quickly brought the airplane's emergency medical kit. Sarah opened it, her hands moving with trained precision. "He's not breathing. I need to start CPR," she announced, her voice firm and professional. As Sarah began chest compressions, Maxwell couldn't help but smirk. "Look at that, the hospital waitress thinks she can save the day. I bet she'll just make things worse." The elderly man finally intervened. "Young lady," he said, addressing Sarah, "keep going. You're doing an excellent job." Encouraged, Sarah continued her efforts. The minutes dragged on as she alternated between compressions and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Sweat poured down her face, but she didn't dare stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man coughed and began breathing on his own. A collective sigh of relief echoed through the cabin. "He's coming back," Sarah exclaimed, a relieved smile lighting up her tired face. The passengers around them started clapping spontaneously. The man's wife, through tears of gratitude, hugged Sarah. Thank you. You saved his life." Maxwell, visibly surprised by the outcome, was momentarily speechless. The elderly man behind him smiled contentedly, making a few more notes in his notebook. One of the flight attendants approached Sarah. "That was incredible. We have a doctor on board, but he's in first class and would have taken longer to get here. You really saved that man's life." Sarah, exhausted but happy, just nodded. "It's my job. I'm glad I could help." As she returned to her seat, the other passengers greeted and thanked her. The contrast with the treatment she had received from Maxwell was stark. When she sat down, Sarah noticed that Maxwell was looking at her differently. There was a mix of surprise and something that could be interpreted as reluctant respect in his eyes. "Well," he said, clearing his throat uncomfortably, "I suppose I have to admit I was wrong about you. That was impressive." Sarah, still breathing heavily from the effort, just nodded in acknowledgement. She was more concerned with cleaning her hands and composing herself than accepting compliments from someone who had treated her so poorly. The elderly man leaned slightly forward. "Congratulations, young lady. You demonstrated admirable courage and skill. Not everyone would have acted so promptly in a crisis." Sarah smiled gratefully. "Thank you, sir. I just did what anyone in my position would do." As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin had changed dramatically. Sarah, once the object of Maxwell's disdain, was now seen with admiration by the other passengers. Maxwell, for his part, seemed to be reevaluating his initial perceptions. The elderly man continued his silent observations, but there was now a different gleam in his eyes, as if he had witnessed something that confirmed his suspicions about the young nurse. Little did they know that this incident was just the beginning. The next few hours would bring even greater revelations and challenges, testing not only Sarah's skills but also the values and beliefs of everyone involved. The flight continued with a markedly altered atmosphere after the heart attack incident. Sarah, still a bit shaken by the intense experience, tried to compose herself in her seat. The silent respect from the other passengers was palpable, contrasting sharply with the treatment she had received at the start of the journey. Maxwell, on the other hand, seemed restless. The arrogant millionaire alternated between casting furtive glances at Sarah and fiddling nervously with his cell phone. It was evident that the recent episode had affected him more than he would like to admit. Encouraged by her successful intervention and the silent support of the other passengers, Sarah finally gathered the courage to confront Maxwell about his previous behavior. "Mr. Rothschild," she began, her voice firm but respectful, "I understand this isn't the flight situation you expected, but I would like to ask you to reconsider the way you've been addressing me and the other passengers." Maxwell, caught off guard by Sarah's sudden assertiveness, frowned. "Oh, come on. Just because you had your little moment of glory doesn't mean—" "It's not about glory," Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "It's about basic respect. Every person on this plane has value, regardless of their bank account or social status." The elderly man behind them watched the scene with evident interest, his pencil moving quickly over the pages of his notebook. Maxwell, feeling cornered, reacted with fury. "Who do you think you are to lecture me on morals? Do you have any idea who I am? I can ruin your career with a single phone call." Maxwell's threats, however, seemed to have the opposite effect. Instead of intimidating Sarah, they seemed to strengthen her resolve. "That's exactly the mentality that's wrong, Mr. Rothschild," Sarah responded, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "Using power and influence to threaten others doesn't make you superior. It just shows how insecure you really are." The nearby passengers, who had been pretending not to listen to the argument, were now openly watching, many of them nodding in agreement with Sarah's words. Maxwell, his face red with anger, was about to retort when the mysterious elderly man finally intervened. "Forgive me for intruding," he said, his voice calm but authoritative, "but I believe I've heard enough." Both Sarah and Maxwell turned, surprised by the interruption. The elderly man continued, "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Thomas Hartley. I'm an investigative journalist and, as it happens, I've been very interested in your recent activities, Mr. Rothschild." The blood seemed to drain from Maxwell's face. "Hartley? The Thomas Hartley who exposed the corruption scandal last year?" Sarah looked from one to the other, confused but intrigued. Hartley nodded. "The same. And I must say, Mr. Rothschild, that your conduct on this flight has only confirmed many of my suspicions about your character and business practices." Maxwell, now visibly perturbed, tried to regain his composure. "This is ridiculous. You have no idea what you're talking about. My lawyers—" "Your lawyers will have a lot to worry about soon," Hartley interrupted calmly. "I have substantial evidence of tax fraud and unethical business practices in your companies. I was planning to publish my investigation next week, but perhaps we can discuss an arrangement. Sarah, still processing the sudden turn of events, couldn't help but feel a mix of shock and a strange sense of justice being served. Maxwell, his previous arrogance completely dissipated, now looked like a man cornered. An arrangement? What kind of arrangement? Hartley smiled, a cunning gleam in his eyes. Well, that depends. How much do you value your reputation and freedom, Mr. Rothschild? The plane continued its course to Los Angeles, but for the occupants of those 3 seats, the world seemed to have stopped. Hartley's revelations had completely changed the dynamic between them, and it was clear that nothing would be the same. Sarah, observing the scene unfold, could hardly believe the turn of events. From a simple nurse intimidated by an arrogant millionaire, she now found herself in the middle of a confrontation that could have ramifications far beyond this flight. What would happen next? What kind of arrangement would Hartley propose? And how would this affect not only Maxwell but also Sarah and possibly many others? The next few hours promised to be even more intense and revealing than any of them could have imagined. The silence that followed Thomas Hartley's revelations was almost palpable. Maxwell Rothschild, who had previously been so arrogant and self-assured, now seemed like a man cornered. Sarah, on the other hand, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Hartley cleared his throat softly, breaking the tense silence. Mr. Rothschild, as I said, I am willing to discuss an arrangement. But this isn't just about money or avoiding a scandal. I'm interested in real, meaningful change. Maxwell, still visibly shaken, tried to regain some composure. What kind of change do you have in mind, Hartley? Don't think you can blackmail me so easily. The journalist smiled, a cunning gleam in his eyes. Blackmail? No, Mr. Rothschild. I'm offering you a chance at redemption. An opportunity to rectify some of the damage your business practices have caused. At this moment, Hartley turned to Sarah, surprising her. Miss, you demonstrated not only professional skill today, but also integrity and compassion. Qualities that, unfortunately, seem to be lacking in Mr. Rothschild's businesses. Sarah, caught off guard, stammered, Thank you, but I don't understand what this has to do with me. Hartley continued, My proposal is this. Mr. Rothschild, you will work with this young nurse to develop a genuine and impactful corporate social responsibility plan. A plan that isn't just for PR but makes a real difference in people's lives. Maxwell frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. Work with her? But she knows nothing about business or... Exactly, Hartley interrupted him. She knows about the real needs of people, about compassion and care. Things your companies seem to have long forgotten. Sarah, still processing the proposal, finally found her voice. Wait a minute. I'm flattered, Mr. Hartley, but I have no experience in any of this. And besides, my grandmother. Hartley nodded understandingly. I understand your concern, Mississippi, but think about this. The plan you develop could potentially help thousands of people in situations similar to your grandmother's. It's not an opportunity that comes along every day. Maxwell, seeing himself cornered, tried one last resistance. And if I refuse to participate in this social experiment? The journalist shrugged casually. Then I publish my investigation immediately upon landing. I'm sure your shareholders and the public will be fascinated by the details I've uncovered. A tense silence fell over the trio. Sarah looked from Hartley to Maxwell, her mind racing with the implications of the proposal. Maxwell, on the other hand, seemed to be waging an internal battle, his face a mix of anger, fear, and, surprisingly, a hint of curiosity. Finally, Maxwell spoke, his voice defeated. How much time do we have to develop this plan? Hartley smiled, satisfied. Well, considering Miss Sarah's grandmother's urgent situation, I suggest you start immediately. Use the remainder of this flight to outline the main ideas. If I like what I see, I'll postpone the publication of my investigation, giving you time to implement the plan. Sarah, still hesitant, asked, And how will we know if we're on the right track? I have no idea how to create a corporate social responsibility plan. That's the beauty of this collaboration. Hartley replied. Mr. Rothschild knows the available resources and corporate structures. You, Miss Sarah, know the real needs of people. Together, you can create something truly transformative. Maxwell, resigned but still reluctant, extended his hand to Sarah. Well, it looks like we have no choice. Let's work together, nurse. Sarah, after a moment's hesitation, shook Maxwell's hand. All right, Mr. Rothschild. But remember, this isn't about saving your reputation. It's about making a difference in people's lives. Hartley leaned back in his seat, a satisfied smile on his face. He opened his notebook to a blank page. Very well, let's begin. What ideas do you have for a social responsibility plan that can truly impact lives? And so, thousands of feet above the ground, an unlikely partnership began to take shape. An arrogant millionaire, a compassionate nurse, and a cunning journalist embarked on a journey that promised not only to change their own lives, but potentially the lives of thousands of other people. The remainder of the flight would be dedicated to intense discussions, brainstorming of ideas, and perhaps the beginning of a personal transformation for everyone involved. The story was far from over, and the revelations and challenges that lay ahead promised to be even more surprising than any of them could have imagined. The plane continued its course to Los Angeles, but for Sarah, Maxwell, and Thomas Hartley, time seemed to have stopped. The challenge proposed by Hartley hung over them, creating an atmosphere of tension and expectation. Maxwell, still visibly uncomfortable with the situation, was the first to break the silence. So, Nurse Sarah, right? Where do you suggest we start with this philanthropic project? Sarah took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. Well, Mr. Rothschild, I think we first need to understand which areas your company could make the biggest difference. Based on what I've seen in the hospital, I can tell you there's a huge need for. She stopped abruptly, tears forming in her eyes. The mention of the hospital made her think of her grandmother and the urgency of her situation. Maxwell, surprisingly, showed a flicker of empathy. Your grandmother, you mentioned she's sick. Do you want to talk about it? Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She raised me and my siblings after we lost our parents. Worked 2 jobs to keep us in school. Now she's dying and I can barely afford the hospital bills. Maxwell was silent for a moment, a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, my own grandmother, she meant everything to me. When I lost her, I swore I'd do everything in my power to never feel so helpless again. Hartley watched the interaction attentively, discreetly making notes in his notebook. That's why I became who I am, Maxwell continued, his voice softer than Sarah had ever heard it. I amassed wealth and power because I thought it would protect me from that pain again. But look at me now. Sarah looked at him with a mixture of surprise and understanding. Mr. Rothschild, I understand your motivation, but using power and wealth to isolate yourself from the world isn't the answer. We can use them to make a difference, to help people like my grandmother. Maxwell nodded slowly. Maybe you're right, but how? How do we create a plan that really makes a difference and isn't just for show? Sarah thought for a moment. What if we start with healthcare? Your company could create a fund to help families with medical expenses, especially for elder care and chronic illnesses. Interesting, murmured Maxwell. We could expand that to include scholarships for nursing and medical students from underserved communities. Create a support network that goes beyond financial help. Hartley smiled, pleased with the direction of the conversation. An excellent start. But remember, this plan needs to be comprehensive. What other areas can we address? Sarah hesitated before speaking. Mr. Rothschild, I know your company is primarily in real estate. Have you considered how your developments impact entire communities? Maybe we could include an affordable housing program. Maxwell frowned. That could significantly affect our profits. Shareholders wouldn't be happy. But think of the long-term impact, argued Sarah. Stable communities mean a stronger local economy. That could benefit your business in other ways. As the discussion progressed, both began to reveal more about their lives and experiences. Sarah spoke about the struggles she faced to pay for her nursing education, working multiple jobs while caring for her sick grandmother. Maxwell, in turn, revealed details about his difficult childhood and how it led him to value wealth and status above all else. "I promised myself I'd never be poor or powerless again," he admitted. "But now I see I might have lost something important along the way." Hartley occasionally intervened, asking insightful questions that took the discussion to new levels of depth and complexity. As the hours passed, the plan began to take shape. It included not only healthcare and housing initiatives, but also financial education programs, support for small businesses in underserved communities, and environmental initiatives. Sarah was surprised to see how Maxwell became increasingly engaged in the project, offering ideas and resources she had never imagined possible. For his part, Maxwell found himself impressed with Sarah's insight and compassion, realizing how much he had missed by isolating himself in his bubble of wealth and privilege. As the plane neared Los Angeles, both realized how much they had changed in just a few hours. The plan they were developing was not just a means to save Maxwell's reputation or to meet Hartley's challenge. It was the beginning of a personal transformation for both of them. "You know," Maxwell said, looking out the airplane window, "when I boarded this flight, I never imagined I'd be rethinking my entire life and career." Sarah smiled gently. "The best journeys are often the ones we don't plan, Mr. Rothschild." Hartley closed his notebook, a satisfied smile on his face. "Well, it looks like we have the start of something truly extraordinary here. But remember, the real challenge will come in implementing this plan." As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Sarah, Maxwell, and Hartley knew that this was just the first stage of a much larger journey. A journey that promised not only to change their own lives, but potentially impact the lives of thousands of other people. The chapter of the flight was coming to an end, but a new story was just beginning. As the plane neared Los Angeles, the atmosphere between Sarah and Maxwell had changed drastically. What had begun as mutual animosity had transformed into an unlikely but promising partnership. Sarah, her eyes shining with enthusiasm, flipped through the pages of notes they had made. "Mr. Rothschild, I still can't believe the scope of what we're proposing here. This plan could really change lives." Maxwell, who a few hours ago would have dismissed such ideas as naive fantasies, now nodded with a mix of surprise and determination. "You're right, Sarah, and please call me Maxwell. I think after all this, we can dispense with formalities." Hartley, observing the interaction between the two, smiled discreetly while making his final notes. "Well," Maxwell said, adjusting himself in his seat, "I think we should review the main points of our plan before we land. I want to make sure we're not leaving anything out." Sarah nodded, picking up her pen. "All right, let's go through it. First, we have the scholarship program for nursing and medical students from underserved communities." "Exactly," continued Maxwell. "And let's not forget the fund to assist families with medical expenses, especially for elder care and chronic illnesses. That could make a huge difference for people in your grandmother's situation, Sarah." The mention of her grandmother made Sarah swallow hard, reminding her of the urgency of her situation. Maxwell, noticing her expression, gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry. As soon as we land, I'll make sure your grandmother gets the best possible care. It's the least I can do after everything." Sarah smiled gratefully, surprised by Maxwell's change in behavior. "Thank you, that means a lot to me." Hartley intervened. "Don't forget the affordable housing program. That could be one of the most impactful initiatives in the long run." "Ah, yes," said Maxwell, his expression becoming thoughtful. "You know, Sarah, when you first mentioned that, I thought it was an absurd idea. But now I see the potential, not just to help communities, but to create a more sustainable and ethical business model." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. And think about how that could tie into the financial education program we discussed. We could create a virtuous cycle of community empowerment." As they continued to review and refine their ideas, it became clear that both were deeply invested in the project. Maxwell, in particular, seemed to be undergoing a significant internal transformation. "You know, Sarah," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "When I boarded this flight, I was a different man. I thought I knew everything about success and power. But you showed me a completely new perspective." Sarah blushed slightly. "Well, you also surprised me, Maxwell. I admit I judged you prematurely at first. But I see now that there's much more to you than meets the eye." Hartley, who had been silent for some time, finally spoke. "It's fascinating to see how circumstances can change people. You two boarded this flight as strangers, almost enemies, and now you're here, planning to change the world together." Maxwell laughed softly. "Change. I guess that's the key word here, isn't it? Changing the world, yes, but also changing ourselves." At that moment, the pilot announced that they were beginning their descent into Los Angeles. Sarah felt a mix of emotions: anxiety to see her grandmother, excitement for the plan they had developed, and a strange reluctance to see this journey come to an end. Maxwell must have sensed her unease, for he turned to her with a determined look. "Sarah, I want you to know that this doesn't end when we land. I'm committed to this plan, to these changes. And, well, I'd very much like to continue counting on your perspective and input as we implement all this." Sarah smiled, feeling a wave of relief and gratitude. "I'd be honored to continue being a part of this, Maxwell." Hartley closed his notebook with a satisfied smile. "Well, it seems my work here is done. You two have created something truly extraordinary today. I can't wait to see how this unfolds." As the plane descended over Los Angeles, Sarah looked out the window, reflecting on the incredible journey this flight had been. She had boarded worried only about her grandmother, and now she was about to disembark with the potential to impact thousands of lives. Maxwell, for his part, looked at Sarah with newfound admiration. He had boarded as an arrogant and isolated man and was about to disembark with a new perspective on the true meaning of success and fulfillment. The chapter of the flight was coming to an end, but for Sarah and Maxwell, it was just the beginning of a new and exciting journey. The plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport with a slight jolt, marking the end of an extraordinary journey and the beginning of something even greater. Sarah, Maxwell, and Thomas Hartley remained seated while the other passengers hurried to disembark, each absorbed in their own thoughts about the surprising events of the last few hours. Hartley was the first to break the contemplative silence. "Well, it's time for the moment of truth," he said, opening his notebook one last time. "Let's review the final plan you developed." Maxwell nodded, his posture emanating a newfound determination. "Of course, Mr. Hartley. Sarah, would you do the honors?" Sarah smiled, still barely believing the transformation she had witnessed in Maxwell. "With pleasure," she replied, picking up the notes they had made during the flight. "Our corporate social responsibility plan is based on 5 main pillars," Sarah began. "First, we have the scholarship program for nursing and medical students from underserved communities. Second, the fund to assist families with medical expenses, focusing especially on elder care and chronic illnesses." Maxwell continued, "The third pillar is the affordable housing program, which will not only provide quality housing for low-income families but also revitalize entire communities. Fourth, we will implement a comprehensive financial education program, helping people manage their resources better and build a more stable financial future. And last but not least," Sarah concluded, "an environmental sustainability initiative, ensuring that all of Maxwell's new real estate projects adhere to strict ecological standards." Hartley listened attentively, making occasional notes. When they finished, he closed his notebook with a satisfied smile. "I must say I'm impressed. This plan not only addresses critical issues, but also demonstrates a genuine commitment to long-term change." Maxwell took a deep breath, a mix of relief and determination on his face. "So, Mr. Hartley, does this mean you'll postpone the publication of your investigation?" Hartley nodded slowly. "Yes, Mr. Rothschild. I'll give you the chance to implement this plan, but I'll be watching closely. If I see any signs that this is just a facade..." "It won't be," Maxwell interrupted firmly. "Sarah has shown me a completely new perspective. I'm not doing this just to save my reputation. I genuinely want to make a difference." Sarah smiled, touched by the sincerity in Maxwell's words. At that moment, her phone vibrated with a message from her aunt. Her smile quickly faded as she read the contents. Maxwell noticed her change in mood immediately. "Sarah? What's wrong?" "It's my grandmother," she replied, her voice trembling. "She's gotten worse. The doctors, they don't think she'll make it through the night." Without hesitation, Maxwell stood up. "Let's go. My car is waiting at the airport. We'll get you to the hospital right away." As they rushed through the terminal, Hartley followed. "Keep me informed about the progress of the plan," he called out. "And Sarah, I hope your grandmother gets better." The trip to the hospital was a blur for Sarah. She barely registered Maxwell's luxurious limousine or the Los Angeles traffic. Her mind was focused solely on her grandmother. Arriving at the hospital, Maxwell used his influence to ensure that Sarah was taken immediately to her grandmother's room. Before she entered, he gently held her arm. "Sarah, I want you to know that, no matter what happens, you're not alone in this. I'll make sure your grandmother gets the best care possible, and that you have all the support you need." With tears in her eyes, Sarah impulsively hugged Maxwell. "Thank you," she whispered before entering the room. The following hours were an emotional roller coaster. Sarah's grandmother oscillated between moments of lucidity and unconsciousness. During a moment of clarity, Sarah shared the news about the unexpected scholarship and the new project she was involved in. "See, Grandma," Sarah said, holding her grandmother's hand. "Everything you fought for, all the sacrifices you made for us, it's paying off. I'll be able to help so many people now." Her grandmother smiled weakly, squeezing Sarah's hand. "I always knew you would do great things, my dear. I'm so proud of you." Those were her last words. Hours later, with Sarah by her side, Grandma Rose passed away peacefully. In the days that followed, Sarah discovered that Maxwell had kept his word. All the medical expenses were covered, and he personally ensured that the funeral arrangements were handled with dignity and respect. A week after the fateful flight, Sarah found herself in Maxwell's office, ready to start working on the project they had conceived together. "Ready to change the world?" Maxwell asked with a gentle smile. Sarah nodded, determined. "More than ever. Let's make this happen. Not just for us, but for everyone who needs a chance, like my grandmother gave me." As they pored over the details of the plan, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. What had started as a desperate trip to see her grandmother had transformed into the beginning of something much bigger. Across town, Thomas Hartley sat in his office, rereading his notes from the flight. With a satisfied smile, he began to write. Sometimes the deepest transformations occur in the most unlikely places. This is the story of how a turbulent flight became the catalyst for a change that promises to impact thousands of lives. And so, what began as an unpleasant encounter in the clouds transformed into an unexpected partnership on the ground, promising a brighter future not only for Sarah and Maxwell, but for countless people their actions would touch in the years to come. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.